All right, good morning, everyone. It's Friday, April 16th, 2021. This is the meeting of the California Fair Political Practices Commission Digital Transparency Task Force. So good morning to everyone. Ms. Linker, would you please call the roll for us?
Brian Brokaw.
Present.
Rena Davis. Dagny Starn.
I'm here.
Dad Kauser.
Present.
Amber Maltby.
Present.
Jenny Wagner.
Present.
And Katie Zoglin.
Present.
Commissioner Wood.
Present.
And Chair Matich.
Present. All right, good morning, everyone. We'll start with item number 1, that is public comment for items not on today's agenda. Do we have any callers on the line or any digital public comment for items not on our agenda? Hearing and seeing none, we'll proceed to item number 2, approval of the March 2021 Task Force meeting minutes. Do Task Force members have any edits or questions on the meeting minutes? Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I'll move to approve.
I'll second.
Ms. Linker?
Mr. Brokaw.
Aye.
Ms. Starn. Mr. Kauser. Ms. Maltby.
Aye.
Ms. Wagner.
Aye.
Commissioner Wood.
Aye. Chair
Matich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. Now to our sort of the main event for today. It's titled A Discussion of Our Proposed Task Force Recommendations. And I know all of you this morning were sent an outline of discussion points. And the goal here today is to get staff a roadmap so that they can start writing a draft report that would then be presented to our task force in May for initial review and comment, and then come back to us as early as June, hopefully by June, for final vote and approval by the task force. If we need more time because we have continuing questions and areas of inquiry, we can certainly push it past June, but that is our current target, to get approval in June. The idea here with the outline is to identify the main and secondary policy questions that I think have been raised during our several meetings with the task force, and to try and identify consensus areas, again, so that staff can get started with that. Before we begin, do any task force members have questions about the process that I just laid out?
I have something I should probably put on the record that I've become aware of since since our last meeting, because I became a commissioner. I had to fill out my Form 700, and in the course of doing that, I had to disclose, I mean, I just own a bunch of index funds, but I had to disclose my husband's holdings. Turns out he holds some Facebook stock. So it seemed like something I should go ahead and put on the record now, even though we're not really voting on anything today.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Wood. I appreciate that. Do other commissioners have any disclosures, comments, or questions? Ms. Hoffman, please.
Thank you. I just had one quick question. There was someone who was supposed to be a speaker at our last meeting and they weren't able to make it. Is that something that's going to be rescheduled, or is that not possible? I didn't know if that's important information for us to have before we go forward.
Right. We did try and reschedule that. We weren't able to, unfortunately. And so given our timeline, we feel it's best to proceed at this point. All right, without further ado then, let's go ahead and move to the discussion points. And if we can have those put up on the shared screen, I think that would be helpful. So, and you can go ahead and, if you wouldn't mind, scroll to A. So the first policy question, of course, in the area of campaign advertisement archives is whether the task force ultimately is going to recommend that the state create a state-run digital ad archive. We've discussed that several times over the several months that we've met, And my sense is that there's a pretty clear consensus on that question, that yes, we should recommend the creation of an archive, and that the real questions for us, the more meatier questions, are how do we design the archive, what goes in the archive, who can access it, et cetera. So I'm of the view that the answer to that first question is yes, that we should make that recommendation, but I wanted to give other task force members an opportunity to express any disagreement with that sentiment. Hearing and seeing none, congratulations, we have our first area of consensus. We're going to recommend the creation of the archive. Now the fun part, moving to B, the secondary policy questions, what information should be contained in that archive? And let's just go down the list. A copy of the advertisement, that seems pretty obvious to me, and based on our discussions, I think that's non-controversial. The sub-question, though, about variations of the advertisement is an open question in my mind. And so I wanted to open up to task force members. How do task force members feel about that? Do we think that that's even technologically possible at this point and beneficial?
Jennifer Wagner, I would say that it's essential. And the inputs that are given to a system like one where Google can generate it or where Facebook can have multiple variations, I think is really important. But again, this comes down to the whole question of, are we creating an API that links to other people's content, or are people actually uploading it all to something that is hosted and managed by the state?
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on that issue?
Yeah, this is Thad Kauser. I mean, I think while I'm open to these questions about technological feasibility, because I think having something that's workable is important, I think this is a key goal to capture the different ways that people advertise. And part of that is because the variations that people are A/B testing, right, can lead to variations in exactly the sorts of things that the public is interested in and has a right to know, and things that scholars want to look at to understand, and journalists are understanding about, you know, what sort of messaging are people using. So if you were thinking about in, you know, should we go fight for some fight on January 6th or not? Or are we talking about things that get close or stay away from magic words that could trigger other legal constraints on how money is used and when, or even things we've seen politicians use, things like variation in the skin tone shading of other candidates, right? I think this is all important for having people be transparent and accountable in their speech. And so I think getting those variations, which if those variations weren't politically important, people wouldn't be spending a lot of time and money in testing the effects of those variations. And that in itself is a justification for capturing them.
Thank you. Other task force members have views on that? So I'm here.
I wonder if there's a practical sort of compromise. I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe the city of LA requires advertisements that are distributed at quantities of 200 or more. And again, I could just be imagining that, but you know, I mean, one approach could be that, you know, there is a distribution threshold, and that way the committee isn't overwhelmed with having to upload, you know, variations that they are legitimately just testing to understand whether or not the messaging works versus the advertisement that ultimately is distributed with the purpose of influencing the election.
I have a question, and Ms. Maltby, I don't know if you could answer this, or Mr. Brokaw could answer it, or any of our other task force members. But so in a situation where a committee has they develop an advertisement that they wish to run on a social media platform, how are the variations created? Is it always in the committee's control to create those variations, or is that something that's done by the platform and the platform? So who would house the variations that we're trying to capture here?
In my experience, chair manager, it would be on the committee side. You know, when I assume you mean testing different versions of an advertisement for, you know, click-through rates, all the various metrics that we test to you know, measure efficacy. That's on the, you know, the committee's end in my experience.
All right, so if the committee, so the situation that we're trying to capture is where the committee has multiple variations of an advertisement that the committee itself has created and given to the social media platform. And some task force members have suggested we want to capture those and house those in the archive as well. Is that everyone else's understanding?
Yeah,
Okay.
Chair, I just want to point out Katie has had her hand up for a while, and so she may have something to say, and then I want to follow up too.
All right, thank you. She's cut off of my screen right now. I'll try and fix that. But go ahead, Katie.
Oh, thank you. I just want to voice, I also agree that there should be the different versions should be maintained. And I want to go back, first of all, I want to thank whoever prepared these written comments, because it's really always helpful to have this written standing point. And there's the comment in this that a Maryland court or a federal district court in Maryland threw out or restricted what could be kept online. And I didn't know if we need to know a little bit more specifics about that to inform our discussion.
Yes, we heard about that in our first meeting, I believe, from our staff who went through that case. I'm happy to send you an additional link to that, though, if you wish to look at it.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
So just returning to the idea of capturing different versions and what the minimum number of, I don't know what it would be like, impressions or targets or whatever should be for that. I'd like to know more from the practitioners about what your minimum number is that you send out when you do your A/B testing. So, you know, when you do your political science PhD, you're taught that once n equals about 30 or higher, you start to enter kind of asymptopia and you can kind of make broader generalizations. So I would assume the number that you could send these out to would be as low as 30 or 50 per treatment group to kind of see what the effect is. But I'm wondering, because we don't want the threshold to be high enough that we would miss those, I think, especially if they're, if the normal group size is pretty small. So I just like to learn more about the actual numbers involved, if you don't mind.
Am I the only practitioner? Because I don't have an easy answer to that. That's something I could probably ascertain. I'm, you know, to be quite candid, that's usually not the level of detail that I'm.
Well, it appears Mr. Brokaw froze at maybe an opportune time for his comments, inopportune for the rest of us. So we'll hang on while he hopefully reconnects here. But Commissioner Wood, so is your concern that in setting the threshold, we don't want to inadvertently set it too high so that we miss out on otherwise relevant information?
That's right. Looks like Thad's hand's up too.
And as a follow-on to that, I would say, sort of in academia, nobody does A/B testing anymore. What they do are called factorial or conjoint experiments, where you're varying multiple dimensions of an experiment at different times. So this image with this wording, with this background, and if you have 2 options of each, well, suddenly you're at 8 types of experiments. Get 5 options for each, boom, boom, boom. You know, you get very, you're getting to very high numbers with small groups. And so, you know, you can set up, and, you know, computers are easy to set up. So you can do, you know, with just a few things, you can set up just a ton of 50 group experiments to analyze them all. And if all of them fall under the threshold, then none of them would be captured. And that would be a concern here.
Well, actually, I want to follow up on that, Professor Kauser, because are you talking about the variations that are tested, or are you talking about the variations that the committee has actually gone to the platform and said, I want these variations put out there? Because I think there's an important distinction that they may test 100 different variations, but only 10 are actually sent to a platform to be put out there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, social media is all one experimental platform, right? There's no difference between, you're testing on real human beings who are receiving these. So you're doing all your testing through a social media platform, evaluating them, optimizing during the course of that, but actual voters are your test subjects is what my impression of how this is working.
Yeah, the thing I'd add is that particularly, you're talking about maybe a Facebook, but if you think about Google Ads, AI is being used, and I'm sure that that'll expand over time. So if you look at platforms where essentially a campaign would put in, here are the 5 images to choose from, here's some sample language, here's some different ways of structuring the links, and then AI just goes and does it. So the campaign only has this list of things they're submitting, and their ability to track through to what were the actual ads shown to which people is pretty low. I mean, I think we heard in presentations from Google that their ability to actually follow the through line through all of the different mediators to here's the site where this was in this combination is kind of complicated. So the campaign's ability to actually know what was shown to who and what the results were is not going to be an easy question for them to answer. And the division between what was testing versus the final ad results isn't necessarily something they'll even know.
So that's really interesting, because then what we might need the disclosure of is the thing that's submitted to Google, the different, right, here are the images, here are the text, and we just assume all combinations showed up.
Well, I think that's one approach, but I would imagine, there may be concerns with, does that not start to at least tiptoe into the realm of proprietary strategic information that, for example, that is unlike any type of information that a campaign would have to disclose with respect to a radio ad or a television ad. And so I think this is, and I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here, but they are different means, and we have to, I think it's important for us to recognize this is a more powerful methodology, certainly more complicated methodology of reaching voters, but by the same time, there are strategic proprietary considerations here that I think we need to be mindful of. And so I don't know, do other task force members have a perspective on that? Where is the right line to draw on this? Commissioner, Task Force Member.
I would draw the analogy and I don't think the analogy changes when you're comparing this to a radio ad, because all of these are inputs into an experiment. We're not asking for necessarily the outputs of the experiment, right? If the requirement is everything that people see, everything that voters and other people in the community are seeing, we need you to disclose that. We're not asking you to disclose how you got to the process of deciding what was the ad that was most effective, but we're just saying, what are you putting out there, right? In some ways, this was really important information that Jennifer was bringing up, because it's almost like hard to stand by your ad because when you don't actually know what your ad is, right? If campaigns are not aware of the final form of their ad, which is most frequently used, that's somewhat disturbing. But I think that's in some ways not, potentially not an issue for this, for this task force. The question would be, I would say, I would be in favor of saying, all the versions of the ads that they are putting out there, everything that's going to wind up on the eyes of the public, they should disclose, and that isn't proprietary information because the end product is, is something that they have actually put out to people.
Right. No, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that's right. It's the end product. But a second ago we were talking about asking the campaigns to disclose on the front end what they were asking for, and I think part of what we're hearing here is they may ask for something in somewhat specific terms, but they can't anticipate at that particular time what the ultimate end result is going to look like. So now I'm starting to wonder whether what we really want is a combination of information basic information from the committees about what they're asking for. And then if it is possible, the images, I think to Jennifer's point, the images that are put out and the iterations that are put out by the social media platforms, which may not be in the committee's hands, I guess. So that's where we get to the question of the bridge between a state archive and the different platforms.
I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying that the campaign is letting AI decide what images to use or the text. There's inputs, so they control what goes in. So they should have some idea, although there's so many permutations of what it could be, and the different dimensions that could happen depending on whether it's a wide banner ad or a mobile ad or something that's in a gaming platform or something that pops up on a screen at a grocery store, right? So those variations are not necessarily all material if you get the inputs.
So Chair Madich, I have a question that might facilitate this conversation. I'm just wondering, the political what we recommend is limited by the Political Reform Act, and there are record keeping requirements that I think justify the archive. Of course, the purpose of disclosure and spending in campaigns. I'm just wondering if we are constrained in these, pre-distribution permutations in requiring those to be disclosed by basically what the extent of what we're authorized to do under the Act, and if staff has looked into that at all yet.
Well, I think you're right if we're talking about pre-distribution, but I think what I'm hearing is what we're actually concerned about is what the end user is seeing. And in this environment, I think that's what makes this so challenging, right? If I understand a traditional campaign, if you will, it's like the campaign may contract with somebody, but they see what the mail piece is going to look like and they sign off on it, then it goes to the printer and then it gets sent out. So that's easy, right? Here, they may come to a platform with parameters and ideas, but there may be 50 iterations of that ultimately end up to the end user. And so how do we capture that in the most effective way for purposes of disclosure? So I agree with you, Ms. Maltby. I mean, it isn't the pre-distribution information that we necessarily want. It's what has been distributed and received by voters. And so I actually have a question for Ms. Davis. If she dropped off my screen, but I think she's still with us, is when those different iterations are created, are those only in the control of the platform, or do the committees get copies of those? How does that work? Okay, all right. I think Ms. Davis may have inadvertently got dropped, and so she's back. Okay. Well.
So I have one more question then, and I mean, this could just be a function of me not fully understanding the mechanics of how the Facebook advertising and other social media advertising works. But from what I'm hearing, one other concern I have is, would this potentially reach poll questions, right? So you do survey research to test voter attitudes, you're talking to voters, you're testing different messages. Now, I mean, is anything that we're talking about now potentially capturing that? And, I would argue that, that certainly is, campaign proprietary information. So I'm just curious if we would reach over into other types of voter contact that are, meant to test and refine messaging, if that makes sense. And again, this could just be me not totally understanding how the mechanics of the social media, the pre-distribution social media communications happen.
Commissioner Wood?
So I think this is a really important line to be talking about. I think we need to really kind of get clear on where we want to draw these lines, because is this is this akin to asking, what did you talk to the focus group about? Or is this more like, what did you put out in the public that can then be distributed really widely, go viral, be screen capped, be retweeted, where a whole lot of voters could see it, right? And like, because the stuff that happens in the, I mean, I don't know how you guys test messages, and the phone conversations, or I'm thinking like the 90s, I guess, right? The focus groups, whatever, right? That stuff's not gonna like get out to the public and affect, right, the voters' sense of information and who the campaign is, right, who the candidate is, or what the ballot initiative's about. I think the thing that like it's not just about strategy. Of course it is about strategy, but it's also about what people are seeing. And I think that because it's so much more public and has so much more public potential, that's kind of the underlying incentive, at least when I think about why we would want to have that information be captured in the archive. But I think we should really try to iron this part out, because I think it's going to be like important to have analytically clear why we would want this when we decide whether we want it.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think this came out a little bit in our conversations with vendors and very small organizations that do political content, but don't consider themselves to be doing political advertising. An example is I ended up speaking with someone who creates t-shirts and posters and other things that promote, a particular sort of political viewpoint, and swears up and down that they're not doing political ads, but Facebook says they're doing political ads. And so, we talked a little bit about how marketing materials that are associated with campaigns like red hats have been used to, either intentionally get around or to truly express people's views without thinking that they're political ads. And I think it's really easy to accidentally regulate things, or to decide that we really intentionally want to regulate things because we do think that they're political. And I think that that's something we don't have a clear, at least I don't have a clear handle on at this point.
Commissioner Wood?
One framework we use to think about this in the First Amendment context is the speaker, right, versus the listener. And so I think right now, when we talk about privacy and strategy, that's about the speaker. We're worried about the speaker, don't want to force this kind of information out of them. But when we think about the information to the voter, and most of the reason for disclosure laws anyway, right, is, well, part of it's about corruption, but a lot of it's about information, right? And so that's more of a listener focused interest. And so that also could be helpful in helping us have this conversation.
Yeah, I want to offer a thought here, and that is, in general, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but in the Political Reform Act, advertisements, and of course we're talking about digital advertisements here, but advertisements are generally defined as communications that are paid for or authorized by a committee for purposes of supporting or opposing candidates or ballot measures. And so if the recommendation was that the archive were to, the committees were required to ensure that the archive contained copies of all of advertisements according to the definition I just provided, by my reading of that, I don't think that we necessarily have to go too far down the rabbit hole of variations, because a variation is still going to be a communication that was paid for or authorized. And then the only question is, how do you actually transmit it to the archive, which is more of a technical question than it is a policy decision. So, and I think by taking that approach, we avoid some of the, what I think are more complicated and difficult questions about how much pre-distribution information is appropriate or not appropriate. And it gets more to the heart of what we really want, which is, what did people see? So I see a lot of people nodding their head. Does that mean maybe we're on to a framework and an approach that might—
Well, I'd still love to hear Google actually respond to that question, because when I've talked to people at Google, they've said that's actually harder for them to pull out for campaigns than you might think. So are they back on?
I apologize. I was kicked off of the meeting, and I didn't hear the actual question. I came in at the tail end, so I don't know if you could repeat it.
Yeah, sure. So the question and the topic that we're talking about is, when it comes to advertisements, and there are multiple variations that may be produced by the platform, at the committee's request, but it's the platform that's producing these multiple variations. If the archive requirement is essentially all advertisements paid for or authorized by the committee are put into the archive, how do we get those variations that are being generated by the platform into the archive?
Got it. So I think to Jennifer's point, from my understanding, it's actually right now not possible to get every single derivation, and to set that up would be extremely difficult in terms of product, just for the way that things are structured. So right now there wouldn't be, like some catch-all that then, could then be fed into the archive, which, I think is consistent with kind of the approach that is currently in place, where, the requirement to report is, on the campaign. But, I do think, with our transparency report, there's quite a bit of information that's contained in there in terms of the advertisements and, what was submitted to us. So to the point of kind of getting the information that's, and I did hear this part, getting information that's input into, our system, the campaign would be fully able to give all of that. And I think it was Commissioner Wood who said, kind of assuming that, various combinations of those limited, inputs that they have. I think there was some comment around, skin shading or something of that nature. That wouldn't be something that could be tweaked within AI, through a Google ad. So I do think that that's something that would be separate and distinct from any ad inputs that we would have. And happy to get a fuller answer if that's not as in-depth as you're looking for, Ms. Wagner.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Thank you for those comments. I wouldn't mind hearing just a touch more how the content is produced. If that you don't have really records of what content was actually produced. For me, it's a very interesting notion.
So sorry to interrupt, but so there is, and if you recall, and I believe it is up on the website for the task force, the presentation that my colleague gave a few weeks ago, that really kind of breaks down and outlines the inputs, it has visuals around all of that information. I think it was Emily's emus is the example that was used, but kind of taking you through various photos, text, that kind of thing. So I think that is a really informative document, and I know there's been a ton going on for everyone. So I would not expect you to remember all the intricacies of that presentation, but there is quite a bit of information in that. And I know that the meetings are obviously recorded. So if you go back and kind of watch her section, it does lay out. I believe there were quite a few questions asked around this area. But if there's any additional information that you'd like, I'm happy to follow up with you.
All right. For purposes of moving our discussion along here, what I am hearing are a couple things. One, what we are interested in is, to the extent possible and feasible, that the archive would include a copy of the advertisement as seen by the end user. And a workable, at least starting point for purposes of defining the advertisement is what's currently in the Act with respect to communications that are paid for or authorized by the committee. And so I think at this point, I think in the interest of time, we should, unless somebody has another comment on this issue, let's keep moving through the bullet points, because I think this has some crossover, honestly, with some other areas in this bullet point as well. So the second point is who paid for the advertisement. I don't, from our prior conversations, remember that being controversial. That's pretty basic to the archive. On what platforms? Again, I didn't think that was something that I heard any objection to through our many meetings together. Now, D&E, I think, are the two bullet points where there is overlap with the discussion we just had, which is now we're talking about on the front end. I think the question is information concerning the audience or the person of the committee intended to reach with the advertisement. Jennifer?
So just to go back to one thing that I think was taken for granted, the idea of what platform an ad is shown on, you would be able to say that the ad is on Google. But again, this goes into the whole variations question of where did your ad actually appear? That won't necessarily be a complete answer in some cases as well, I think. So I just want to make sure that the expectation is that you would say, we put this into this ad supplier's system. Where that ad supplier put it is not necessarily disclosable, is my understanding.
Yeah, what is meant by that is all the platforms that the committee paid to place the advertisement on. I think you're right. I mean, at some point it may be beyond the committee's knowledge where it was distributed beyond that, but certainly we want to do the best we can.
All right, I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Understood. All right. So,
Chair, if I could just say one thing, sorry, since I got disconnected, I don't have an answer to the specific question, but you know, we often will test anywhere from like 7 to 10 variations of each individual ad. So before, you know, settling on finals. So just, I think it would be very, very cumbersome to archive literally every variation of each display ad or other digital ad that was tested before being put into before voters. Sorry, I just wanted to finish the thought from earlier.
All right, thank you, Mr. Brokaw. So task force members, comments, ideas on what information concerning the audience that the committee intended to reach. I mean, I think there's basic, the time, that is how long it ran, obviously, what geographic region it was intended to reach. Beyond that, what other information do we think would be fair under these circumstances to require disclosure of?
Chair Matich, could you or legal counsel remind us for radio or television advertisements, what's currently required to be disclosed? And I think that would help us think through the analogy, or help me.
I don't know that we have Mr. Bainbridge, our general counsel, with us today, but I remember, and it's the region, the time, and the stations are the three that I know certainly are disclosed as a matter of course.
I can tell you a tiny bit more than that. So the link is through the political file at the FCC, and you know where the station is, and you know what program it was running during. I think the only way to then know who was targeted, but it's fairly straightforward, right, is to know who watches these shows. And so I target to, you know, the local news in Fort Worth, Texas on the CBS station. And then I just know who watches that particular show, or Jeopardy or whatever, right? 60 Minutes. And so you just kind of know who, like what the demographics of the viewers are for that sort of thing. And of course, that's the missing piece for the way that online ad targeting / audience is actually knowable or unknowable to us.
But my question is whether or not, well, I mean, maybe especially to start off, you want to just sort of echo the kind of demographics that you have to disclose for TV and radio. But isn't part of the reason why we want more transparency in the digital realm is that the kind of targeting is so much more, well, targeting is much more focused and potentially pernicious in the focus. I mean, it has its wonderful sides, but it also has its negative sides, as we've seen in the past several elections. So I don't know whether it might behoove us to look at additional criteria given the unique qualities of digital advertising. You know, so for example, I'd ask, you know, what are qualities or parameters that advertisers, political advertisers look for beyond geography? You know, there are a lot. And so perhaps we want to delve into that a little bit more.
Well, can I ask Ms. Ogden, you used the word pernicious, and like what, I think from the, and again, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here to try and spur the discussion, but I think from the campaign standpoint, I imagine they see a tool, social media as a tool that allows them to be more efficient in reaching audiences that they want to influence one way or the other, whether it be on a candidate or a ballot measure. So I think from their perspective, they're simply using a tool that's available to them. I think there are other potential uses of targeting information that could be unlawful. I mean, if people are trying to target, hate speech, for example, I mean, I think everyone agrees that that's a bad thing, right? So I just want to have an understanding here, a working understanding of when you say something like campaigns may use this in a pernicious way, what are we talking about exactly? Is it just simply that they have this new tool that allows them to be more efficient, or is it that there's a concern with them reaching certain groups? Like, what exactly is the concern?
Well, I mean, just to give a general example is, like ones that the Russian, groups use to influence politics. So they leverage normal social media using advertisements and things, but it did it, I think, in a pernicious way. So it's that, so the micro targeting, as I understand it, can be echo chambers for like what you were saying, hate speech, or dog whistles for certain causes. So, and it may be just in this first iteration when we start off, you want to start off broad or just general, and then maybe it's a question of fine tuning it down a couple of years down the road. So it may be that it's just easiest at this point to start off with something that just parallels other systems, and just because it's easier to start off with and deal with the more difficult issues later down the road.
All right, thank you for that.
I don't know if that helped explain it. I'm sorry if I'm not being very articulate.
No, I thought that was great. Do other task force members have comments, thoughts on this issue?
I would just go back to my earlier question. Does the Political Reform Act, I mean, is this something that the task force can do, or is this something that requires an amendment to the Political Reform Act? And I was just looking at the reporting requirements is a description of goods and services, and of course, the Political Reform Act is quite long and detailed, but I'm not sure the Political Reform Act at this point allows for requiring the disclosure of the targeting universe that we're talking about and the level of detail that we're talking about. So I would want to look further into that. So just raising that point.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I mean, part of what the task force, what we're doing here is, from a policy standpoint, identify potential policies that we would be recommending to the legislature ultimately. Because you're right, I mean, the Political Reform Act right now doesn't have a state-run archive, so we would need legislation to set that up, pay for it, and define the parameters. So everything we're doing today presupposes that we're going to have to go to the legislature at some point and get new statutory authority to do this. So the question is, in that recommendation to the legislature, are we recommending that certain targeting data be included or not at this point? Jennifer?
So I think of this as kind of two components. There's the corrective component, which I think Commissioner Wood spoke about quite eloquently. And then the transparency issue, and that a lot of the articles that were shared with us when we first got started was around how perhaps knowledge that a campaign had ethical issues early on maybe wouldn't get out for that campaign, but that person's reelection campaign would often be seriously affected. So clearly voters care about that information. And I think when you get into exactly which audience got exactly which information, that can be very important to corrective measures and to that transparency around conduct. And I think that's where I'm thinking there might need to be more regulation or clarification. I don't necessarily have ideas how to do it, though.
Thanks. Mr. Brokaw, I'm going to put you on the spot again because I've actually been meaning to ask you this. As somebody who works in this space advising campaigns, when somebody puts out something negative against your client on social media, how do you effectively engage in counter speech from a practitioner standpoint? Because I think there's some assumption that we would need a high level of targeting data perhaps to do that effectively. But what's your experience today when that targeting information isn't readily available?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I've been trying to. I'm hearing an echo of myself, but I've been on both sides of this. I was leading a campaign where an opponent was spending heavily on digital, and there was led to a website, and it was because it was a legislative matter, not a not a campaign issue. There was little to no disclosure whatsoever. You had to be really, we essentially could not and had no ability to find out, even though we knew where the money was coming from, there was no way to actually show it. And so we didn't have any way to counter message. We couldn't go to those, we didn't know who they were targeting. And so that particular circumstance was very difficult, and we just had to fight, we just had to guess what our battlefield was and fight in, just through our own best guesses. It wasn't like we could go to the the local TV stations and pull the file and see that they were broadcasting on during the View or whatever. Like it was just guesswork, and there was no way of doing that. The only other thought I had just a few minutes ago, in talking about how you put, disclosing your targeting. Let's just say, we do polling on a campaign and we realize that our target universe is women, aged, 40 to 55. I work with a media buyer who tells us that, people who watch The View are likely to fit in our demographic. So we buy advertising on The View. I'm just throwing this out as an example. So what would be the difference between that? I don't have to disclose that polling data showing why we targeted those voters. So if I just wanted to go, advertise on Facebook, we happen to know that, we can target people who like the Views page on Facebook. That's sort of like the analogy that I wrestle with. Why would we not have to disclose that on TV, but then have to disclose something that's essentially analogous on social media? So I'm wrestling with this. I understand the arguments that are being made, but and it's especially difficult when you're on the receiving end of an attack that you don't know how to counter. So it's a good conversation to have. I don't have an easy answer. Yeah.
Thanks. Ms. Davis?
Hi, and I know this has been stated in our presentations and before, but at least for Google, I can't speak on behalf of other platforms. The targeting criteria is limited to age, gender, and geographic location, and it can't be a radius around a certain location. So in terms of deep criteria around audience and things of that nature, it's, you can't target your ads based on those factors. So, there's a limit to even how much, there would be to gain from, that information.
Thank you. Mr. Kauser?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was very, very helpful as I'm struggling to think through this, to think about what Brian was saying about the playing field and trying to figure out where the playing field is. So one analogy I'm thinking of, so if we were looking at a disclosure of a radio advertisement, saying that somebody advertised on iHeartMedia would not be sufficient disclosure, right? That's the giant conglomerate that has 850 media stations. That doesn't give you information about where the station is, what kind of audience is looking at. The current disclosure requirements allow you to narrow that playing field so that someone who wants to engage in counter speech could define that. In a sense, if we only had, say, it was a Facebook ad, that is essentially like saying it was advertised on iHeartMedia, except it's even less informative because there's so much, it's such a broad playing field. And so it seems like one way forward would be the similar to what we were talking about with the inputs to different variations of the advertisement, the inputs that a campaign is giving to that media advertiser of age, of the things that Ms. Davis said, those whatever inputs are allowed to create the targeting, that could be disclosed, because that's in some ways like giving you the station and the show, essentially.
All right, that's a good point. Commissioner Wood?
Yeah, and that actually, so when we think about I know Washington State has been doing some stuff where they're interpreting their prior existing statute to require, I want to say they're thinking about doing targeting, or maybe they're already doing targeting. I'm kind of forgetting now. But when I was on the phone with one of the commissioners 6 months ago, he said that they think of it as basically showing your receipts, right? So like, this is the product that I purchased. So very much like Professor Kauser's been saying, right? Like I targeted these people. This is like part of the transaction that occurred. So then it raises a second question, which is, I mean, I'm not in this world as deeply as so many of you, but my understanding is you can use a group, like Catalyst or, one of the other groups, to generate basically a list of names to target based on whatever criteria you give to that group, because they've got a lot of, columns in that data set on who to target. And then you can take that list, at least to Facebook. I'm not sure about the other platforms, and they will target those people for you. Now, I've argued in my academic writing that certainly we don't need that list of names, right? But you might need to kind of capture who the audience is. I don't know. I mean, that was when we were saying that the platform should do it. But anyway, that's like a second piece of this, because if we say you've got to reveal your targeting, that makes this whole situation a little bit more hydraulic, and because it'll push platforms to get a list, or not platforms, excuse me, campaigns to get a list that they then take to the platform, right? And so if the interest is in counter speech, again, you can't find the playing field. And so it's just like, I'm taking Professor Kauser's comment and saying, okay, assuming this is where we go, which I don't know if that's safe yet, right? Then what do we do about people who generate the list elsewhere? Because it's not really part of the transaction. It's like part of a prior transaction.
Interesting. Ms. Davis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, sorry, just a quick comment in reference to Commissioner Wood's comment around Washington. I just wanted to just point out that Google ads are not, political ads are not offered in Washington based on just some of the difficulties in terms of their regulation and our product model. So I just wanted to flag that.
All right, that's a good point. Although, I mean, just to put a fine point on that, well, I guess let me ask the question, and Ms. Davis, if you know this, or Professor Wood, you know it, but the targeting data that Washington is currently requiring be disclosed, is that obligation placed on the committee, or is that an obligation that's placed on the platform to provide the information that they were requested to, or essentially what they are being requested to do from the committee? Whose obligation is it in Washington?
I'm actually not sure. I would defer to the professor, the learned professor.
The forgetful professor who's been pandemic for a year. I don't know if I can say either. And I actually, as I was raising it, I was like, I haven't refreshed myself on this case enough to really be talking about this. So sorry for leading us astray. I can try to figure that out for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to follow up with my colleagues as well.
All right, that'd be helpful. All right. Well, it sounds like, based on this discussion, for purposes, again, of just kind of getting staff going on a draft for our consideration, at a minimum, we want the audience information that would be analogous to what is being disclosed currently for television and radio. There is an additional piece of that we talked about, which is all of the inputs that were given from the committee to the platform. And I think that's the part that would be perhaps unique to what we're doing here and would be different than the TV and radio. I'd also point out that unless I'm misremembering, the inputs is something that you can go to like Google's database currently and get some of that information already. So we're not, in that sense, this is something that's already being made publicly available. So I don't think we're necessarily going beyond what's already happening. It would just be through the state-run archive as opposed to through the Google and other platforms archives.
Correct. And that in our transparency report where that information is contained is available online as well as in a downloadable format that could be used to populate a database.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, and actually moving then I think to because we were talking about the information on the front end, in terms of the audience actually reached, I know Google and other platforms also currently provide some public disclosure of that, how many, at least that's my understanding, how many impressions, et cetera, were generated from the ads. I assume that is something that we would want similarly to have in the state-run archive, but do commissioners have, task force members have views on that?
Well, I have a question. How would you measure that? You can't measure eyeballs. You can measure if they click on something, but if it's just an ad just showing on a screen, do you count that or?
Well, let me just ask Ms. Davis, do you know, how is it currently, what is the technical way that you're currently capturing that information for purposes of disclosing?
I'm actually not sure. I'd have to take a look at our transparency report, but again, happy to add that to the list of questions my colleagues to follow up on.
All right, great, thank you.
I can offer a tiny bit, not Google specific, but I know that at least for the 2018 election, when you went to buy, the rates varied based on impressions or clicks. And so that implies to me that they're able to measure it, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I don't know technically how they do it. I just know it's currently being done. And so I think we would also want that information, again, since it's already something that we're capturing publicly through the private archives, that we would want to include that in the state archive as well.
I think, and I think one reason why having an eyeballs, sorry, Jennifer was in line ahead of me.
Jennifer, do you want to go? Then we'll go back to Professor Kauser.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to have the clarification of not only impressions and click-throughs, but particularly whether someone's clicking through to whatever the campaign's directing them to. So if there's like something to donate or something to sign up versus the ad and the ad disclosure, because I think there can be multiple click-throughs on this particular piece of content. And so that level of nuance of interaction, I think in particular is interesting to us, because if we're going to create this database and have people click through to the database versus to the campaign, would be a distinction to watch for.
Hold on, I'm not sure I totally followed that. I thought you were talking about if there was an ad that had a link trying to track what was clicking through to it, and then I thought I heard you talk about clicking
on
through
an
the archive.
ad,
So what exactly?
you could click through to whatever the campaign is directing you to click through to. But in theory, if we're putting insignia on the ad saying this is a political ad and it will take you to the state database, that's a different click through than the click through to the campaign itself. And so I want to track those as two separate things if that's possible. If there's existing data on whether people are clicking through to the campaign or to the Google disclosure database, or to this, state information if it's outside California, and then looking forward, are they clicking through to the campaign, or are they clicking through to our database, assuming we're making one?
Okay, thank you. Professor Kauser and then Ms. Davis.
Thanks. And please call me Thad since I was using first name with others, and only current students call me professor, not my former students, such as those who are fellow task force members. So I just wanted to follow up that I think having both a click through, but making sure that we don't lose an impressions or general eyeballs level of viewership, I think will be important as we move towards more streaming services. So if someone is listening to radio streaming or watching a television streaming service, they're much less likely, my understanding is, to click through or interact with that ad in any way, but we would still want to capture the fact that they received that ad, and something that is like a gross rating points, audience size measure, I think will be the most analogous to current reporting requirements.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Yeah, I know that we were going to have staff looking into some of the parallel or analogous requirements around radio and TV. And I'm just curious if there are any sort of measurement tools that are used in those mediums to gauge audience interaction, or if this is something that would be unique to social media platforms. I'm just trying to think of, if there were, I know we talked about, kind of iHeartMedia versus the station versus like the show that it was advertised on, and, the audience that may have, responded to any sort of engagement based on that. I know sometimes you get a survey, how did you hear about us? And then it says, XYZ amount of things. So I'm just curious if any of that information is captured for other platforms where advertisements are published. And I didn't know if staff could look into that, or if any of our very knowledgeable colleagues on the task force might have an answer.
So I can tell a little bit about the FCC Political File. The answer is no. And not only that, I mean, the FCC Political File needs a task force like this. It's crazy how they do, not crazy, I shouldn't say crazy. It's like hectic and wild how they do it. So every station for every buy basically PDFs a form, which at least when I checked it last was sometimes handwritten. Okay. So like just, and it will just say like, the campaign Abby Wood for Congress paid for, 2 30-second spots during Jeopardy for Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And the total amount paid was $10,000, And so all this audience stuff, I know this is done, right? Is like, you're like, okay, they're advertising on Jeopardy. So they want, I don't know, college grads or people who are home during that time or whatever. And so it's more than just, it's more than just what you kind of see, right? It's more than just the show and the station and its geography, because it's all the stuff that we know about the show that goes into it to comprise the audience, right? But certainly we don't have any engagement information. We don't even have it in a format where we can compile it. But like, I also don't think matching them should be the goal, right? I think like, at least on the usability front, we need to do much better.
Ms. Davis.
Sorry that my hand was still up. I didn't lower it. That's good. That's very helpful.
All right, thanks. All right. Any more task force member comments on bullet points D or E before we move on? All right, hearing none. Item number 2, what types of advertisements should be included in the archive? To my mind, I think obviously state level candidate and ballot measures, that's the whole point of doing this. As tempting as it would be from a just good government standpoint to have one database where you can get everything, including the local races, I think that's not realistic, one, right out the gate. And number 2, it would be duplicative. There are already some local jurisdictions, we heard from Los Angeles, that's already doing this. So there's no reason to duplicate what they are already doing. In terms of issue advertisements, we did talk about this previously, and I think the consensus at the time, although folks should feel free to argue with me if they disagree, was that issue advertisements would not be something that we would recommend putting in the archive now, but that the archive be built in a way such that if at some point in the future the state regulates issue ads in a robust way, that the archive could be used to house those advertisements. And then digital versus digital and non-digital. Again, I think right out the gate, my recommendation would be that we recommend that it be digital advertisements. I think that's the biggest concern today. But if it could be constructed in a way that would allow for non-digital advertisements to also be included in the future, I think that would be ideal. But those are my thoughts and understanding of what we talked about. So other folks, please chime in.
I will just add, I am fully in support of either initially or eventually expanding the database to include non-digital ads. I think I think there are just really important interests that are promoted with this archive, including, it allows for enforcement, it supports the already in place record keeping requirement. So I think it helps the informational interest for the public. It helps the regulated community in meeting their compliance requirements outside of just uploading to the database, and it helps the FPPC on the enforcement side. And it creates an efficiency when doing something like an investigation. I'm just thinking about responding on behalf of clients to subpoenas and finding all of this information. So there's an efficiency component to this too. So I just wanted to say I am all in favor of either initially or eventually making the archive for all advertisements regardless of format.
Great, appreciate that. Commissioner Wood?
So I was actually kind of surprised to hear you blow through local candidate and ballot measures. And I saw some nodding too, so maybe I missed part of a conversation, but local politics can be really nasty and there can be a lot of disinformation that flies under the radar and that sort of thing. And so if that's just a loser right now, then we don't need to put time into it right now. But I just, to me, it seems like the information benefit may be even higher when it's local like advertising for local candidates. And so, and for ballot initiatives. And so I wouldn't mind kicking that around a little bit, but if people are just really convinced that we only want state level races, and that's fine. I will also just one point of clarification. It's not just statewide, right? It's also like assembly and Senate.
Right, no, state level candidates, not just statewide offices. So assembly, Senate, all the constitutional officers, et cetera, and then state level ballot measures. And on the local race, I mean, part of it's a practical concern with just trying to get it up and running, including the hundreds of local jurisdictions that we have. There's also, I think, another concern I have is oftentimes folks may be filing with local filing officials who are accustomed to receiving information from them. And so now if they're filing some reports with their locals, but then they have to send copies of advertisements to us, I think at least early on that may be too burdensome for candidates and other folks who are participating in the local races, who frankly, compared to statewide races, have fewer means typically. I just think it may be difficult right out the gate. So that was kind of my thinking with that piece. But Ms. Ogden, I saw that you saw your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree with the comments you initially made about this bullet point number 2. Excuse me, and the comments about the local. But I do have a question for you all, because for us in local races, at least in my community, most of the advertising I see is not digital, but rather it's local newspapers or sometimes it's the online version of newspapers, but or just printed flyers. So I didn't know if other people's experience in their local communities, if there's a huge amount of digital advertising.
I think this varies from the cases that I've looked closely at. So looking at a California city of 200,000 people, their campaigns for city council and mayor are in the $5,000 to $30,000 range, people are doing, you know, advertisements that are very old school, and making, and, you know, having their friend be a treasurer, their spouse be a treasurer. They're filling out state form 660s, FPPC forms to disclose all their spending, but it's all just going up on a PDF on a website, and there's not an interaction with the state database. There's not a, you know, very professionalized treasurer. Go to a large county, then it's incredibly sophisticated campaigns using full digital media, spending millions of dollars, and it's a completely different world with a much more analogous to a small state. But there, you know, there's also in those jurisdictions, you also have a much more sophisticated local, but you have a much more focused and well-resourced local ability to create an archive and a regulatory scheme.
Thank you. That's helpful.
All right. Do other task force members have comments on item number 2? Hearing none, let's go ahead and move to item number 3. We've talked about this a little bit previously, but I think it's worth having a continued discussion today. Who should be responsible for providing the information to the state for inclusion in the archive? To me, I feel very strongly the obligation should be on the committee. I think they are in the best position to provide, obviously, copies at least of the ads that they have in their possession and that they have provided, and the information, the inputs, to use a term we used earlier. I think they're in the best position to do that. Structurally, it's consistent with how the Act currently operates. I mean, it is committee's obligation to maintain certain records and file reports and turn over certain information to the state. It's pretty unique that we currently are taking an approach where I think, shifted that burden to private actors such as the platforms to be the ones to provide that information and be responsible for it. So I think our recommendation should be very strong that it's the committee's obligation. I do think that Ms. Wagoner made this point, and perhaps others did too, and I'm just not remembering it, but that if there's, I think we shouldn't discount the possibility that platforms may want to contract with, or excuse me, committees may want to contract with platforms if the capability exists to have that information directly transmitted to the state. And I think that's fine, as long as the ultimate legal obligation rests with the committee. And so they're simply using a service that's being provided by the platform for compliance purposes. So what do task force members think about that? Jennifer?
I appreciate your inclusion of that. If we're going to make a request of staff, I'm curious if they think there's any special language that needs to be used with influencers, essentially where there's a middleman where someone is hiring somebody who has a personality online, essentially, and then they are, you know, either paying for ads or boosting things, and kind of how that might be handled, because the receipt itself may or may not be as transparent, because you tell this influencer you want them to do certain things, and then what the influencer decides to do may not be included in that. So I'm just curious what staff would say around how we would handle that.
Yeah, I think I can take a crack at that. I think the idea would be that if you're a committee and you've paid an influencer to put out certain content on behalf of the committee, that I think that would satisfy the definition of an advertisement that we talked about earlier today, and that would be the committee's obligation to get that from the influencer and make sure that it finds its way into the archive. I think in the ordinary course, again, that's the committee's obligation. Could be the influencer that sends it as a practical matter, but ultimately the obligation should be on the committee to make sure that it's being done. Ms. Davis?
I was just going to note that at least on our platform, there is a box that influencers check if they are being paid for any content in their post. So they're you know, that kind of that understanding that they need to identify paid promotional content is embedded. So I think that, you know, to the commissioner's point around the burden laying on the campaign, you know, it certainly, you know, that box could spark a conversation with a campaign, or and obviously the campaign would have the ultimate burden of reporting versus an influencer who may or may not understand FPPC law and the act. So I just wanted to highlight that is part of the flow for an influencer, so they are aware that there's an advertising disclosure requirement.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I agree with both 3A having this be a burden on the campaign, and 3B. I think this will create a nice new business model for Google and Facebook, who certainly need more business. So well done. But thanks. Thanks for raising this question about influencers. What makes someone an influencer? So is that anyone who receives payment for the message that they're doing? So if a former mayor of New York who's running for office then decides to pay lots of people, lots of independent contractors, a small amount of money to hire a ton of people, they may not be people who have large businesses as influencers. They may be someone who's a 25-year-old who just has a good number of fans. Does that what makes someone an influencer in Facebook's definition or Google's? Sorry, Facebook's. What trigger reporting?
Well, I represent Google, but it's okay. It's okay. No, I actually don't know the technical answer to that in terms of YouTube and the platform. I think that would be a pretty difficult term to define, in statute. It's kind of one of those things that, even 3 years ago, was there such thing as an influencer? I don't know. 10 years ago, certainly not. But I do think the concept of, paying folks to advertise, certain products is not new, and having that following. I'm not sure, if we can get at, that exclusive definition, or if perhaps, relying on, the more kind of broad and basic terms that are included in statute around advertisements, around folks who are being paid by the campaign, is something to rely on and use as a thread. But certainly, it may be something that solidifies over the next couple of years, and then perhaps then it may be something that could be defined with a little bit more, I would say, just stability around the definition. That's, I think, part of the trouble with trying to regulate some of emerging technologies is that they're always shifting, and you have to be very nimble. And I think this is probably one of those areas. But happy to again kind of add that to my list and see if there is an official definition that we use that could be useful to the task force in defining any of these terms.
Sorry, I don't know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I think at least from the standpoint of the commission and the Political Reform Act, I think our biggest concern is if a person, however you want to, whatever title you want to bestow upon them, is being paid to put political content out into the universe. That's what we're worried about. So an influencer may be one variety of that. A blogger is another variety of that under certain circumstances. Maybe they're a blogger and an influencer, I don't know. But I just think in terms of writing our recommendations, maybe we may be a little bit more, for lack of a better term, boring, and just people who are paid to put out the content. And that's kind of how I think about it, because influencer could be defined many different ways, I think, by different people.
One thing I've talked about when I've written about this kind of stuff is just to say that it's organic speech, right? So it's like their actual speech. It almost like is kind of like an endorsement, as opposed to something that would more traditionally look like an ad. I don't think that gets us all the way there, but it might be, I don't know, language. It could be helpful. Sorry if you can hear my partner.
No. I think to that point, though, I think you're right. Organic speech wouldn't ordinarily meet the definition of advertisement under the act, because I think what you're saying is organic speech is where you're literally just speaking on your own behalf. You're not actually being paid for it, right?
Well, paid organic speech would be an influencer, right? As opposed to just organic speech, which is me saying I really support Rena Davis for Senate, which I would.
Paid organic speech.
I've seen this in real life, and it's very, this was the the same campaign I was referring to where we had no idea who was funding this opposition, but the same effort was paying influencers, and I've considered Professor Dr. Kauser an influencer for 20 years, as long as I've known him. But these were people that were had 50,000, 100,000 followers. I have no idea who they are, but they were either YouTube people or D-list actors or whatever, and they were all of a sudden weighing in on this obscure legislative issue, and it was clear as day that they were being compensated. Yet there's absolutely no way for us to counter that or to show the world, except through earned media, what was happening. So I actually think this is something that needs to be, and it's going to happen more and more, I think, moving forward until there's some sort of effort to clamp down on it.
Thanks. Ms. Davis?
And just to be clear, it's just really more of a question. The concern is with folks who are with campaigns that are not reporting influencers as paid political. Okay, that was my understanding, not the organic speech. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the line is about payment, right? So if you're paying someone to speak on your behalf, right? Now, with many people, that transaction happens through the medium of a social media platform, right? Campaign does not know those people, does not have a relationship. They're paying Google to pay those people, right? But the trickier question becomes then, what if I hire people, pay them directly, then they go on these platforms and make that speech? To my mind, it's still the same. It still raises all the same sort of legal questions and would trigger the same disclosure requirements. But it's not going through the social media site. And so having that 3A approach of the committees who paid for the speech being the ones that are required to report it, then would cover both of those two ways of getting paid speech on advertisements, essentially.
Ms. Davis, and then Commissioner Wood. Ms. Davis.
I promise I'm going to get better at lowering my hand. I apologize.
It's okay.
That was also very helpful, Professor, and I think that it seems like just kind of grounding ourselves in the fact that this is an advertisement and continuing to express that to the folks and socialize it again, because this is a new medium. It just is something that I think, within, even our report we can reflect that based on the existing terms. I appreciate that clarification.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Wood?
So I'm not sure this is the right kind of agenda item or place on the outline to bring this up, but when we're talking about what people are paying for, these off-platform purchases that happen for follows and likes and retweets and all that, bots, sock puppets, all of that stuff is something that we want to consider. And it may be, when we're talking about committees, right now we say committees who pay for the ads, we may want to consider including amplification. This is something for the task force members. This is something that I raised yesterday in the commission meeting, and got a lot of blank stares. And so, it might be helpful to kick around this idea at some point during this meeting today of how we want to handle amplification. Because, there's an emerging kind of argument in the First Amendment world that's lower value speech and more subject to regulation. It also may be really important and informative for the public to know when the group speaking to them or the person speaking to them is actually a robot or, somebody who's not really involved and doesn't really have stakes, like a fake person, fake name.
That is, Commissioner Wood, you're right. Just yesterday, we spent some quality time talking about that. And I think, and also, we had law and policy, or at least I had law and policy committee earlier this week, and we talked about it there too. So it's the third time this week I get to talk about it. But
I did not mean to say blank stares like nobody in the room understood. It was more like people are like, what? Why are you bringing this up now? So anyway, I think I just did it to this room too. Sorry. Okay. And I also interrupted you, so now I'm really going on mute.
That's all right. So I think in terms of a situation where you have a committee who is paying an influencer, who then in turn may use other people to push out the content, right? Or bots may be used to put out the content. I see sort of two pieces of that. The first piece is, and we talked about this commission level, so the commission's already looking at this through our regs, which is how can we improve the detail of reporting on expenditures to make it clear when you're reviewing a campaign report that certain payments were for amplification or certain payments were for sub-vendors of the influencer to push out the message. So there's the disclosure of the payments going to particular people or bots or entities or what have you. And even just influencers themselves, currently the way the reporting requirements work, you don't have to be very specific on which influencers you may be paying to push out your content. Well, this is one of the things the commission is looking at now. Should we require more specificity with that to improve transparency? So there's that piece of it. Then there's the what types of disclaimer should be present on the content that's being pushed out by the influencer, maybe the sub-influencer or the bot. And again, that's an issue that the commission is also looking at. I think the interesting overlap for me here is we're talking about a digital advertisement archive, and much of that content pushed out by the influencers, the sub-influencers, the bots will satisfy the definition of advertisement, and ensuring that the committee is being responsible and including those in the archive, I think to me is the most critical kind of nexus here between what the commission's doing on this front and what the task force is looking at in terms of the creation of the archive. But then again, you're right, Commissioner Wood. I may not totally understand like the bots and everything, so you got to tell me if I'm off the mark on that being kind of like the framework.
No, not at all. And that's why I raised it now, right? Because we're talking about who does the disclosing. And so that's kind of an additional reason for the committee to be the one doing that. That's why I brought it up now. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up now. I was trying to figure out where bots would go into this. To my mind, they seem to, I think amplification is more analogous to somebody buying a repeater that takes a radio show and sends it broadly, right? Rather than someone creating a known advertisement. But I think like that purchase of, a contract with a bot fund, right? Or a purchase of, or an expenditure to create, to an individual programmer to create the bots would seem to be something that would fall under that advertisement realm. One question I have, so Richard, it seems like following your line of reasoning through, if we're defining as an advertisement, a payment to an influencer, then the content of what that influencer says, even if it's paid organic speech, that speech is then classified as an advertisement, and that content should be contained in the archive. Is that a correct read of the line of reasoning that you're taking? It's something that we should be about.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I would support that as well.
Okay. And if it would be helpful, next month we could have staff do kind of an update on what the commission is looking at in terms of disclosure and disclaimers with influencers, so task force members can see kind of the interaction between what we're doing here with the archive and what the commission is currently doing with respect to those issues. So, and I promise that can be a relatively brief presentation. So I'll add that to next month's agenda. So appreciate you guys bringing that up. Anything further on number 3 before we move on to number 4? Hearing and seeing none. All right. Searchability functions for the archive, and I'd actually also just kind of, in addition to searchability, really just design of the archive is more of is a broader term. And I would say we had a great presentation last month from Ms. Seasonberry from the Center for Civic Design. And I would say, I don't know exactly the particulars of it, but the goal for the design of the archive kind of writ large would be to ensure that it is easily accessible by the average voter, and it's easy for them to find the information that is most important to them, but then goes through, also allows people who may have a heightened interest in certain information who want to drill down, the ability to also do that through the archive. So kind of as they called it, the bite, the snack, and the meal. So everybody at the various levels is able to drill down to the extent that they want to in the archive. So that's not here. I didn't get that in that number 4, but that is in general, that is very much in my mind that I would want staff to include that in the recommendation. But with respect to searchability and other things, what are task force members, what are your views on that?
I have one question for when you talk about the names of the committee that pays for the advertisement, would we also be doing sort of like parallel to other disclosures where it's like disclosing like the top 3 donor, people behind it, because we all know that committees can, have all kinds of names that you don't really know where the money's coming from. What level of detail might you be thinking of there?
In my opinion, I would think that we would want to have the committee name, the FPPC ID number, and a link to the committee's landing page, et cetera, where they have that type of information. So I wouldn't want to reduplicate. Again, I want to avoid duplication. And so to the extent that that information exists other places, I would want to create a link to it. I wouldn't want to just duplicate it as part of the archive, was my thought on that.
That makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Kauser?
Thanks. So someone who spent a lot of time, like I remember the old days when you had to go to the Secretary of State's office with a pencil to get campaign finance records and write them down. Many of you have probably been to that room, and then struggled with a California database that was far below average across states with databases. I think the principle, right, is that every field of information that we have should be searchable either through the member of the public. If I'm a member of the public and nibbling at it, and I want to be able to maybe I want to say, look for a specific candidate and find out, what our campaign is doing. But maybe I want to say, wait, I was listening to my online radio station. I heard this ad and I want to find more. And so I want to go by the provider in the date range, right? Anything that isn't a separate field, we should have the sort of individual consumer be able to search on that, so that however they received information that they want transparency about, they would be able to find it. And then for the use by others, and that includes a tiny bit scholars, but really there are a lot of public groups that take the underlying data of campaign finance and create sort of usable things. So I think like MapLight made the most usable version of the California campaign finance database. There's a San Francisco group that was just really a group of programmers that took San Francisco city data and created a very useful public interface for that. And so the key thing there is open API. So not downloadable in cell form, but an open API version, so that any secondary user can download that data, use it in any format they want, and also create that sort of relational database style way of making it broadly accessible.
Thanks for that. Jennifer?
So I would ask staff in this area to think about the performance and affordability trade-offs. And you've talked before about an evolution plan, that there's the thing that they first build and then how it could expand over time, and thinking very carefully about, if we're going to do something like the Center for Civic Design recommended, where we have community review that shapes, well, which content is most important in which ways, that we recognize that this is not the ideal initially, and that we do what is going to be high enough quality that it's a strong proof of concept.
Other comments? Commissioner Wood?
You know, I wonder, I mean, maybe we're past the stage of doing these, having people come present to us, but I wonder if it would be worth it to have the Center on Responsive Politics, the opensecrets.org people, come and talk about how they would use the data too, or MapLight or somebody. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe, you know, what Professor Kauser said is enough, but Thad said is enough. But it occurs to me that we haven't really heard from a group that would be downloading it like all, you know. I don't know, maybe that's too much.
Well, no, I think it's a good point, and it's something that we would want to do. I mean, we're trying to make, I think, again, kind of going back to where I started, the big picture here is we want it to be accessible and usable and efficient for multiple different audiences for maybe different purposes, right? The casual person who's interested in seeing the ads and who paid for them versus the academics, news groups, good government, et cetera. And so I think we could legitimately state those as attributes of the archive that we are recommending be created without being so prescriptive as to say it has to be precisely like this. I think in our recommendation, we need to be clear what we want and who we want to be able to use it in the way that's most effective. And then ultimately it's going to go through, you know, the legislative process, and that's going to be where the sort of a lot of the details get worked out. And we may recommend that they consult with various stakeholders to ensure that the design is consistent with that goal. And I think that's a fair and a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I like that option. Thank you.
All right, great. Any other questions or comments on item number 4? All right, then finally at number 5, any other particular elements, features of the archive that task force members want to give some direction to staff on? I think, Jennifer, I think you were first.
So I have 3 areas. One is training and customer service. So how we provide support as it initially rolls out and then evolves over time. The second one is complaints, enforcement, and audits, because we talked about that a little bit. And then the third is around the insignia, the whether we have a particular logo and how all of that works.
Okay, can you go into a little more detail what you mean about the complaint, enforcement, and audits?
Sure. So
features
if
of
we,
the archive.
yeah, if we have this database and then the burden is upon the campaign to file, how are we going to handle complaints that something isn't in the database or that it seems inaccurate? You know, what the staffing would look like for that, what the standards are going to be, because it sounded like as these databases evolve, we heard from a couple of speakers that you know, their customer service, if campaigns are concerned that it's not being reported quickly and accurately, is a big deal. And then what burden is the state taking on in terms of making sure that this database really is complete and thorough and accurate? And will it do its own audits? Will it have outsiders conduct audits? You know, because it has this API, is it going to encourage audits by academics or other groups? So just thinking about that component of it.
Okay, great, thank you. Katie?
Sorry, need to unmute. Just a minor point is something that might also be included in the report is how long do you want to maintain the database? Just because at some point it may or may not become unwieldy or more difficult to access, or maybe you want to keep everything forever, I don't know, but there may be costs implicated and that may impact the commission's decision.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. All right, training, customer service, enforcement, complaint, and audits, insignia, timeline, maintenance of records. Any other additional areas that staff should address in the draft recommendations?
This might be a little far afield, but I was just thinking about the Public Records Act request related to this kind of stuff. I mean, it seems like if they could just download, then that wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it just kind of in mulling over like what it means to hold this many records, and does that interact at all with Public Records Act requests in a way that would just really pile on work for staff? I would assume not. I would assume they would be like, here's how you use the API, go have fun. But I don't know, so it might just be something to consider.
Okay, we can have staff look at that as well. Sort of the interaction between creating this publicly available database and the Public Records Act requests.
I mean, just as a general matter, I mean, I'm a local government lawyer who handles Public Records Act requests. So obviously I don't mean to speak on behalf of your staff, but if it's on a public website, usually you can just refer people to the public website if it's all there.
No, thank you for that. All right. We've now come to the end of item number 1. Thankfully, item number 2 is much shorter. But before we leave item number 1 in the archive, do task force members have any final thoughts on that? And again, we're going to continue to have opportunities to refine this and provide more input on it, but at least this will give staff something to get going on in terms of an initial draft. All right. Number 2, we've also talked about disclaimers on digital campaign advertisements. And on this one, I was really struck by some of the ideas and the approach taken by the Center for Civic Design, as well as the presentation that we had from the folks with the Digital Advertising Alliance. I think there are a lot of creative ideas out there for ways that we can perhaps more effectively design and implement disclaimers, particularly in the digital space. And so what I don't think is that we have perhaps the time or the capability to prescribe all of those to the legislature. And so instead, my thought here was that we have an organization and probably others who have a record of doing this for the state. Center for Civic Design did it with the ballot pamphlet materials. Would it not then be something worth considering recommending to the legislature to have such a group examine how we're approaching disclaimers on digital ads and recommending some improvements that would make them more usable and effective for end users? So I'm curious what other task force members think about that.
I agree. I've been thinking about this one because I think that maybe also you could outsource it to them. I was thinking maybe the state could do some kind of grant or something, because I do think it will require a little bit of research before a good recommendation can be made. And so I think your suggestion, I think, is a really good one. I agree with you.
All right. Do other task force members have views on this item?
I'll just note, and this may have been apparent from my pointed line of questioning, I wasn't hugely excited about the click-through symbology approach that the voluntary, a lot of concerns about whether that varied disclosure or enhanced disclosure, but I think setting up commissioning a study, let the people who are involved in that study, come to their own conclusions. But I think sort of, I might not have the greater use of links and symbology as I wouldn't want to make that appear as it sort of almost does at the end of this paragraph as something that this commission, that this group task force is necessarily endorsing.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that. Ms. Davis?
Yeah, I think it might be useful for us to add in some bits in that recommendation around the technical feasibility and how something like that would function. Would it be something that's embedded in the ad by the committee, from start to finish, but just how that even might function, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, even if we think having a symbol could be a good idea, how does it get on there? Who watches it, et cetera? I think that's a really good point. And going back to Thad's earlier point, I didn't mean to suggest that I think symbology and links necessarily were something we should do, because I agree with you. I mean, they couldn't, unfortunately, we didn't have evidence or information presented to us about the success rate of actually clicking through, and that's critical. I mean, if nobody ever clicks through, then I think going to just a symbol is actually less disclosure than we currently have. We don't want to do that. But I think that's part of the reason I think studying it might be useful, putting a finer point on what that click-through rate is. All right. Anything further from task force members then at this point? I feel like we've talked through a lot of issues. I think we have a pretty good roadmap to turn over to staff. Anything else before we adjourn for today?
I mean,
Davis,
just to
you have your
thank
hand
you.
up.
Everybody was so helpful and productive today. This was awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, this was great. Rena, you have your hand up again. I'm not sure if that's just.
I promised I was going to get better, but apparently that's in futile nature. So I apologize.
It's okay. We'll be back next month. So.
I'll do
All
better.
right, you guys. Thank you very much for your time and your work on this. I appreciate it, and we'll see you guys next month. That was great. Actually